Tēnā koutou haere mai and welcome to this virtual media conference. Here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, it is almost 2 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, also the APEC 2021 chair, has just concluded the first ever APEC Informal Leaders Retreat. The Prime Minister has made some time to take your questions. She'll do that very shortly, but first I'll hand over to her for her opening remarks.
Good morning. APEC leaders have just finished their retreat. As chair of that meeting, I'm pleased to update you on our discussion. We are a year and a half into the COVID-19 global pandemic. The human and economic consequences have been devastating. Every day there are 100,000 new cases of COVID-19 in Asia-Pacific economies, with no sign of slowing down. Well, some of our economies are recovering. Last year saw 81 million jobs lost in our region, and the biggest economic contraction since the Second World War. It will be some time before all APEC economies recover the levels of well-being we saw pre-COVID. We held this extraordinary leaders meeting, the first in APEC's 32-year history, because we are facing these extraordinary times together. During our 2.5-hour session, we focused exclusively on our response to the biggest health and economic crisis in memory. As well as exchanging views among APEC leaders, we also heard insights from the International Monetary Fund and the World Health Organization on the response. This meeting was an opportunity for leaders to join together and discuss a shared path out of this crisis, a path that confronts the pandemic while laying the foundations for an inclusive, sustainable and digitally enabled recovery. The conversation was rich, so I'll try not to encapsulate every point that all 21 leaders made, but I would summarise the discussion under 4 themes. First, we agreed on the overriding imperative to tackle the health dimensions of COVID-19. We need to suppress transmission, do everything we can to get as many people vaccinated as soon as possible and strengthen our health systems. To support these goals, we need to keep our supply chains of vaccines and other medical products operating as smoothly as possible. Second, we discussed the challenge of sustaining our economies through the health crisis so we can accelerate our economic recovery. We need to target stimulus measures to sustain jobs and businesses. We need to keep our markets open to one another, including by building confidence in predictable trade rules in the World Trade Organization and elsewhere. When the time is right, all our economies will need to look at the reforms we need to make to harness our region's innovative spirit, so the Asia-Pacific remains the most prosperous and productive part of the world. Third, we discussed the idea that in designing our recoveries, we should be thinking about how we can emerge with more sustainable, inclusive and digitally enabled economies. By taking smart decisions during the crisis, we can both manage the immediate impacts and build more resilient and productive economies. We can emerge from this crisis with better infrastructure, a thriving small business ecosystem, and a workforce with the right skills for better jobs. We can build more sustainable economies and support our climate change goals. We can also make sure these groups that have been hardest hit by the pandemic are not left behind, including women, small business, rural population and Indigenous people, each of which was covered by many leaders today. The final theme was the cooperative spirit which underpinned everything that was shared. Each of the economies will need to chart our own paths through the crisis, but none of us are alone, nor can we achieve the full potential of safe and healthy economies by going alone. We're ultimately all in this together. By collaborating, exchanging ideas as we just have, we can all find a faster way through this crisis. By coming together for this extraordinary meeting, APEC leaders showed their unity of purpose, and it is through joining and working together that we will grow together. In summary, what we did this meeting, what it delivered, firstly, by having this extraordinary meeting now, leaders have set a strong expectation of the outcomes we want in November. These include making sure that APEC economies have followed through and have lowered tariffs on vaccines moving across borders. That is really critical. And that economies have accelerated digitalisation of border paperwork, reducing costs on businesses. Top of mind for leaders is achieving widespread access for vaccines. This is the overriding focus for APEC in the world. APEC's already agreed to work collectively to speed up the flow of vaccines across borders. As leaders, we're focusing our efforts on how to get vaccines to everyone as soon as possible. This means that we have collective agreement to move beyond vaccine nationalism, and we're focusing on all aspects of contributing to the global vaccination efforts, making vaccines, sharing vaccines, and using them. Leaders were also pushing for collaborative and practical solutions on safely reconnecting the world. These could include vaccine passports, travel green lanes, quarantine-free travel bubbles. This is a challenge to which we were looking to find collective solutions, and I'm confident we will. I'm happy now to take questions.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Let's go straight to the questions that have been submitted from our media. Thank you very much for putting those through in advance. If I call on you, I'll ask you to unmute yourself, then ask your question and mute yourself again. Please also make sure that your camera is on. We've had plenty of questions coming through. We will try and get through as many of these in the time that we have available. We're going to begin with a few questions from local media here in New Zealand who are attending in person. And a note to our international participants, you will hear the local journalist asking their question, but you won't see them on screen. We'll begin with Derek Cheng from the New Zealand Herald.
Prime Minister, bear with me a second. The WHO says we need 70% of the global population vaccinated by June next year. That's estimated to require 11 billion vaccine doses and a $50 billion global vaccination plan. The recent G7 agreement to share at least 870 million doses was described recently by Gordon Brown as a moral failure. There's lots of nice words in this leader statement, but what concrete commitments, if any, were made towards a global vaccination program targeting lower income countries, in particular around the world? And what role in that will the $3 billion sub-fund that's just been announced in Chinese state media play in any support of a global vaccination rollout?
Yeah, for that latter part of the question, I would look to that APEC member nation in order to expand on that. For your more general question, you know, for the critical issue of vaccine rollout and access, that was definitely one of the key topics, as you would expect today. Here, we need to draw on the role that APEC can play in that regard. And in that respect, we need to look at APEC's strengths. APEC has traditionally, of course, been a forum where we have tried to make sure that goods and services, that trade moves and flows freely. So our endeavour has to be to focus those strengths and that practice on vaccine and also those health tools that help us address this pandemic. Now, in that regard, 4 weeks ago, APEC trade ministers met together and agreed to remove any existing trade barriers and tariffs that exist for vaccines and consumables associated with the vaccine rollout. It may surprise you to know that vaccines can in some cases face tariffs of 6%. Vials and packaging, 20% in some cases. Syringes face tariffs. So it is a very real problem that APEC economies have the ability to remove. We have challenged ourselves to make sure that we act on that over the coming months, and this was a chance to reaffirm at leader level the importance of that to enable greater access to vaccine. The one final thing I'll say, whilst it's facilities like COVAX that have the ability to make sure that there's the equitable distribution of vaccines, what you did hear from leaders today was a commitment and understanding that we will not be safe until we are all safe. So a lot of discussion at an individual level of the donations that will be made and the work to expect over the next few months to distribute vaccines beyond their own borders.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Our next question is from Jacob Johnson of Television New Zealand.
Prime Minister, given this was the first time that Joe Biden and Xi Jinping have been in a meeting together since President Biden was sworn in, were there any tensions between the two leaders? And as the chair of the meeting, if there were, how did you manage those?
I would say no. Actually, I found it to be both a productive meeting, but one in which all leaders were engaged and totally focused on the issues that we as a region face. And that, of course, includes the health response to COVID and the economic response and the role that we can all play collectively as APEC economies to accelerate our recovery. So no, that wasn't an issue that I had to navigate as chair at all.
Let's go to our next question now from Sam Sachdeva from Newsroom.
Kia ora, Prime Minister. APEC has spent some time talking about the idea of a free trade area of the Asia Pacific,
Yeah.
PAN. Asia Pacific Free
Yes.
Trade Zone. What are your views on the concept?
Yeah.
What are the obstacles at present to making that a reality, and what would you say the odds are of making any meaningful progress on that vision in New Zealand's hosting year?
Yeah. Look, it's obviously, as you would expect, a nation like New Zealand that supports multilateral trade agreements. We would support endeavours to grow those agreements, and one that is specifically focused on the APEC region. However, I would acknowledge that for such an agreement, there are a number of challenges in instigating such wide-ranging agreements. We already, of course, have, though, CPTPP and RCEP, which in many ways overlaps parts of the region. And so here we have existing agreements where we can continue to bring in economies that will be of significant benefit to New Zealand. I will say, for instance, that on my call this morning with President Biden, I acknowledge some of that architecture that already exists, for which we would welcome the chance to bring the United States in to those agreements which have a very high standard.
Our first international question now, we'll be heading over to Eric Martin from Bloomberg. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Prime Minister, I wanted to ask you about the possibility of a digital trade agreement for the Indo-Pacific area and the interest of the Biden administration in such a deal, whether this is something that was discussed and where there may be synergies or opportunities with a digital trade agreement to strengthen collaboration and integration in the region, including on solutions for the pandemic and for the health crisis.
Look, different leaders raise their perspective on tools or future opportunities within APEC economies, from everything to removing friction at the border through digital technology, to trade and digital-related trade issues, through to digital inclusion. So right across the board, we had different perspectives on those issues. I don't know if you could hear my response to the last question, but there I would just acknowledge that we do have, albeit as a subset of economies, examples of some of the opportunities that exist through agreements like, for instance, the one between Singapore, Chile and New Zealand. So there are models there that exist, fit-for-purpose models that exist. But equally, we're always open to have these conversations with APEC economies who want to draw in others to that dialogue.
We will go now to Jia Zong from Saishin Media. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes. Hi, Prime Minister Ardern. I'm from Saishin Media. I want to ask, as APEC countries move forward with economic recovery in the region, what can we do to strengthen an open economic environment and at the same time avoid the data war? Because considering the APEC's data issue involves big and small economies with various degrees of digitalization, as well as transnational hegemonic tech companies. Thank you.
Thank you. When it comes to issues around data protection, for instance, APEC does have work streams on this area and on this subject matter, which we, of course, will continue to progress. But it's fair to say there's a diversity of approaches across APEC economies that do pose some challenges as we work in that space. What I would point to, though, are some perhaps if I may call it that, some shining lights, some examples of how we can make progress in these areas. The Digital Economy Partnership Agreement between Chile, Singapore and New Zealand is an example of that. And so certainly we as members will continue to seek those opportunities to demonstrate what's possible within the region whilst we continue those work streams to make progress as a collective.
Our next question comes from Shaima Khalil from the BBC. Please ask your question.
Kia ora, Prime Minister. I'm hoping you can hear me okay. I'm wondering what discussions you had regarding the Delta variant specifically. How would you describe that challenge at this point of the pandemic? It's breached Australia's defences, for example. Sydney's back in lockdown, Melbourne is back in lockdown. The New Zealand-Australia bubble, for example, it keeps getting suspended in certain areas. It's ravaging Indonesia, for example. It's now become the epicenter of Asia, the new epicenter of Asia. Vaccination supplies still remain a big issue, but these are countries with different circumstances within the epidemic. How does APEC then streamline this? How do you reach a consensus? I understand that there are general principles about streamlining or about making it easy for countries to have access. How do you prioritize? And speaking of streamlining, are you worried that tensions between China and some of the countries is going to come in the way of cooperation and recovery in the coming months?
To answer the latter part of your question first, that is not something that has been borne out in the discussions today. So if I could just simply reflect that. On the issue of the Delta variant, there wasn't specific discussion on an individual variant or indeed any individual variants. But there were two themes that came through very strongly from the leaders. One was that this pandemic has a while to run, and that there is significant work by all of us to be done, and it needs to look beyond our domestic borders. So that's again why I'd say it is so important that we as leaders came together and reaffirmed what only a few weeks ago trade ministers agreed. Because it is not, at this stage, the fact that we are even having to discuss tariffs on vaccines or consumables that are relevant to the pandemic will surprise some people. But these still exist. So we have a job to do to remove those, and we're committed to that as APEC economies. But the second strong theme was agreement and acceptance by everyone, and perhaps this was triggered by the WHO being at the beginning of our meeting, that this will not be the last pandemic we experience, and that preparedness is critical, and that whatever expense we are experiencing now as economies and as a region with 80 million job losses, that the amount that is having to be spent to make sure that we are stimulating the economy and recovering will be much, much greater than the investment that we need to put in place to prevent a future pandemic. So there was a strong focus on the need for future prevention.
Our next question comes from CNN. Over to Will Ripley. Please ask your question.
Good evening from Tokyo, Prime Minister, and congratulations on your largest ever Kiwi Olympic team, which will be arriving here starting tomorrow, I believe. I want to ask you about Taiwan. Japan's white paper, as you well know, its annual defense report, mentioned the issue of Taiwan Strait stability for the first time. Do you agree with Japan's concerns over increasing military intimidation against Taiwan by mainland China? And what role do you see New Zealand and other like-minded APEC economies in cooperating and countering China's rising assertiveness?
A very interesting, in-depth foreign policy question. I'm not sure whether or not it's necessarily relevant to the leaders' retreat we had today. I can tell you that Japan's white paper was not a subject of discussion at the leaders' meeting today. And that when it comes to security issues, they also weren't topics of discussion. And that is primarily, of course, because the subject matter that was set down was very much focused on economic issues and health-related issues for APEC.
Our next question is here in the room in Wellington. It comes from Stephen Wright from the Wall Street Journal.
Prime Minister, as you know, the APEC region encapsulates a whole range of countries from very poor to wealthy like New Zealand, and some of them are facing a much more dire situation with the pandemic than others, Indonesia being one example, with thousands of people dying in the past 2 weeks. I wonder if leaders discussed the potential risks to regional stability from that developing situation in Indonesia, and whether actually more specific measures were actually needed to address that, in particular by APEC.
As you can imagine, rather than necessarily stepping back and saying what will the impact of this devastating pandemic, which is ravaging us in third waves, mean for security and stability, actually the subject and the topic of discussion still continues to be what will the effect be on people. So that tended to dominate the conversation more than the wider strategic impacts on the region. Yes, from an economic perspective, it was discussed, but not from a regional security perspective. And that's probably only natural when those countries have a seat at the table, and for them they're talking about those specific rollouts and vaccine programs. For Indonesia, absolute acknowledgement of what they're experiencing at present. And what I would say is that we did hear a lot from other economies around their ongoing donation plans, and what they probably will have taken away are what the specific needs of those economies are. Whilst APEC is not generally geared up to be a clearinghouse for vaccine donations, what I do expect is that as a result of conversations, countries will be much more aware of where both surplus vaccine exists and where need for vaccine exists. And we need to continue to encourage the sharing of vaccines, particularly across those areas that are experiencing those waves.
Our next question comes from Neil Sands from AFP. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Kia ora, Prime Minister. Talk about increased preparedness for the next pandemic and monitoring for the next pandemic, but how realistic is that when the origin of the current pandemic is still murky, because China sees that as, it feels it could damage its national prestige if it's seen to have originated there. When you've got these questions of national identity intermingled in that, is it realistic to expect transparency on these issues?
Well, here, you'll forgive me if I step out of the APEC chair role and speak from a New Zealand perspective, because I wouldn't want to extrapolate or make assumptions about for instance, the second report from the WHO having not in specific detail discuss those questions. But look, from New Zealand's perspective, our view is that it is in all of our interests, given that this will not be the last pandemic, and given that at any time, particularly with our change in the way that we live, that at any time we could see a crossover between from animal to human transmission of future pathogens. And so you will see New Zealand in particular, in the wake of the independent report co-chaired by past New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark, a very active response from us to encourage the architecture that will help in the future create as much transparency as we can in a strengthened World Health Organization. In particular, we support a pandemic treaty. That's something that I believe nations will have the opportunity to potentially build and work towards as we look to the UN General Assembly later in the year. And that's an area where, as a nation, we'll look to play a more active role.
Our next question is from David Lawler from Axios. Go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for taking my question. You mentioned that access to vaccines has been quite uneven and the need to remedy that going forward. Here in the US, there's a lot of focus on the potential need for boosters. And obviously, a lot of countries have purchased vaccines already with boosters in mind. In your view, would it be wrong for rich countries to start rolling out booster shots before other countries have had enough doses for the first wave of vaccinations? Thanks.
I mean, ultimately, the goal of a vaccination campaign is immunity. And so that's what everyone's striving towards. Now, I can't stand here and give you a judgment on the currently, at this point in time, of the need for booster shots in order to ensure immunity. But that's what everyone is seeking. What I would just continue to encourage each and every one of us to take responsibility for is to try and build the pace of immunity in a way that reduces the likelihoods that we'll see variants. Unfortunately, at the moment, even within immunised nations, if we have a situation where we continue to see infections grow, we run the risk of variants emerging. So even amongst vaccinated populations, it's going to be incumbent on all of us to try and reduce down those conditions whilst we ensure that we have that even access and that equitable access of immunisation and immunity, regardless in what form that needs to take.
Time now for our final question, over to John Mayer from Reuters. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I was just wondering, with all the discussion around vaccine supply and availability, was there much discussion around a waiver for intellectual property rights around COVID-19 vaccines? And was there any discussion around wider use of vaccines created by China and Russia in the region?
More so to your first point, there was discussion on the issue of waivers. And many countries speaking in support of that. And you'll see that APEC trade ministers supported taking that issue to the WTO and continuing to pursue that. But what I would just acknowledge is that there are other challenges, as I've set out, that equally need to be addressed, that APEC trade ministers have also agreed to, and which we need to continue to hold all our feet to the fire over the coming months to reduce those barriers to access to vaccine.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for your time. It's very late here in the evening and we appreciate you making time for this media conference. Thank you also to our members of the media here in Wellington and around the world. The links to the recordings from tonight's media conference and other media materials will be emailed to you shortly. Mā te wā, we'll see you all soon.